Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you all. Welcome from the Dharma Field Zendo. As Jed said, hopefully it won't be too long before we'll be seeing some of you sitting here. And also to the fathers out there, happy Father's Day. I can honestly say I didn't realize until yesterday that today was Father's Day. So I picked the topic of this talk a couple weeks ago already. And so I spent a part of the week working on a talk, and when I realized it was Father's Day, I thought, I'm just going to go with the talk that I have. So perhaps to some of your relief, I won't be speaking about fathers or Father's Day today. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a talk that's titled Neither Sacred Nor Profane. And I'm going to give a talk that is a little different from the way I usually give talks here. I'm actually going to just read a text, and I'm going to offer some commentary on the text. And the text that I'm reading is titled Neither Sacred Nor Profane. It's from Steve Hagen's book, Buddhism is Not What You Think. So I'm just going to go ahead and go through the text, and I'll stop from time to time and make comments on what it is that I'm reading. All right. One of the classic Zen teachings is no dualism. But what does this mean exactly? Dualism is our separating the world into this and that, self and other, good and bad, right and wrong. To the extent that we conceptualize, dualism is right here. And while dualism has a legitimate place in our lives, it helps us communicate with one another and function in a multifaceted world. It can never be an accurate representation of reality, let alone reality itself. So what I just want to point out from these opening paragraphs that Steve has made clear is that dualism and conceptualization, the way he's talking about it, they go hand in hand. So conceptualization is that breaking up of the world into things, into this and that. And when that arises, when we have conceptualization, then dualism arises as well. And dualism is it's either this or it's that. It's self or it's other. You can only have it one way when we're thinking in terms of dualism. It's right or it's wrong, good or bad. Even if we think we can split the difference and say, well, it's bad, but it's got some good. And we're still thinking in those terms. We're still thinking in terms of good and bad and right and wrong. And with this appearance of things, it just arises right along with it, comes in a way our assessment of those things, and it shows up frequently as feelings, right? So we see what's taking place and a feeling arises with it. And what we do is we ascribe that feeling to the things that are showing up. So we'll have a sense that it's a positive experience, a negative experience, or a neutral experience. And then what we'll do again is we ascribe that to the things that are showing up, the things that are arising. So we'll say to ourselves, actually, we don't. I'm describing this. Often when I talk about this, it sounds like it comes in steps. Like we see the world, it arises, and then we do step two. Step two is to have a feeling about it. And then step three is to, understand where that feeling is coming from. It all just kind of comes together. And so what we'll do is we'll ascribe something that's taking place out there that is generating this feeling. And that is what's showing up. So things arise. With that arising come feelings. And from those feelings comes a conceptual understanding of our experience. And what's interesting is our understanding, our conceptual understanding of what's taking place, if we're pushed to actually articulate what it is, I don't know if you've ever done this, where you think you have an understanding of something that's going on, and then somebody asks you to explain it, and you try putting it into words. You start to realize that as you try to articulate your understanding of what's going on, that it's actually harder to do than you thought. And I'm not saying this is always the case, but it's more often than you think. If you actually try to explain, what your understanding is of what's going on, you find out that as you put it into words, it's difficult to put into words. And you might even find that as you put it into words, it seems to be changing with the words, where you go, oh, that's what I was thinking. So you start to have some insight as you try to put this into words. And of course, this is how a lot of therapies work, especially if they're therapies that involve a conversation with the therapist, is you have an understanding of the world, and then your therapist tries to get you to articulate into words. And one of the things that you start to notice is that the way that you put the world together isn't really the way the world is put together. That this is just an idea that you have, and you realize it when you actually start to say, well, this is what I understood was going on. So we can even see the benefit of trying to express what we think is going on in words. But regardless of whether we do or not, the point I'm really trying to get at is that what we do when we try to express in words is we start to realize a disconnect between what it is that's what reality is, I guess, and what our intellectual or our conceptual understanding of that reality is. So, and I just have a note here that I guess I'd like to share with you, because I used to see this. I taught freshman composition at a community college for a number of years. And I used to see this happen in my students' papers all the time, where they had a very, as you could imagine, like they had an understanding of some topic that they just put into square boxes. And the more they could put into square boxes, the happier they were, because then they could just link those boxes together and meet the 3-page requirement that they had to have. And they would often write arguments that were just a list of the things they were going to talk about, rather than trying to figure out what they were actually trying to say. And what would happen over the course of the paper, to their chagrin, because I would notice this, is they finally started realizing the complexity of even their own thought only at the end of their papers. And so I would point out to them, I would highlight this sentence, and I'd say, this is what you're actually thinking. What you thought you were thinking about for the previous 2 pages, or 3 pages actually, none of that's really it yet. So you have to go back and figure out how what you were saying before actually reflects what it is you're saying. And it caused great consternation on the part of my students. So know that it often shows up that way, as kind of an unsettled feeling we have, that we think we know how the world is showing up, and then it turns out to be something else. And again, when, as we look closer at this chapter, one of the things we're doing again is we're just interpreting the world through dualism, dualistically. And there are inherent limits of dualism. To dualism. It's of its nature to be limited. And the reason why is that because dualism comes together with conceptualization, with the world that's broken up into things, dualism is limited to the way that the world is broken up, to the understanding that I'll say the options that are given to us, it's either this way or that way. Again, if you've ever encountered somebody, especially somebody from another culture, and they listen to the way you've sort of broken the world up, and then they go, well, it could be like that too. And your jaw just drops open, because previously the world seemed like it was just constructed this way. So there are inherent limits to dualism, because it is rooted in things, because it's rooted in a fragmented way of understanding reality. And as you can imagine then, with that understanding, thinking that this is the way reality is showing up, troubles can arise. And Steve does say this. He says, in fact, dualistic thinking gets us into all kinds of troubling and painful situations. It leads us into worry, fear, anxiety, and confusion. But it doesn't have to be this way. For while we habitually think in dualistic terms, we never actually live in dualism. So again, we think about dualistic thinking gets us into all kinds of troubling and painful situations, because again, what's happening is we have an understanding of the world, which is rooted in this dualistic understanding. And then we act and we respond to the world from that dualistic understanding. And meanwhile, the world isn't working that way. The world is just working the way that it works. And it doesn't care what kind of understanding we have of it. It's not going to suddenly start working just to match our understanding. It's just going to unfold the way that it's going to unfold. And that can lead us into troubling and painful situations. Can lead to worry, fear, and anxiety. Why? Because the way we thought the world worked isn't the way the world seems to be working. And think about that. If you have encountered that, and I think all of us have at some point, where the way that you understood things to be, to actually have that shaken right to its very roots, how unsettling that is. It's truly unsettling because it's getting at, in a way, I would say at our sense of identity, at a sense of who we are. And who we are comes along with how we understand the world that's around us. So the world just keeps working, whether or not, it matches our ideas about it or not. Now, we might hear something like that. So dualistic thinking gets us into all kinds of troubling and painful situations. And then we might think, oh, well, dualism is bad. Dualism is something that I need to get rid of. I need to get rid of that because it's going to lead to troubling and painful situations. And Steve addresses that, as you might imagine. And he says, it's not that dualism is bad or wrong. It's just that we easily get stuck in it, believing that the way we framed everything in our thoughts is how things actually are. We think that the way we account for things in our minds, the way we separate things out from one another, somehow gives us a handle on reality. As a result, we regularly operate in ways that are completely out of touch with how things actually are. For example, we see some things as sacred or holy and other things as worldly or profane. We separate the transcendent from the mundane, belief from ignorance, insight from delusion. Yet in doing so, we fall right back into the same habit of dualistic thinking. With this assumption, we ripen ourselves for contention with others, with the world, and even with ourselves. So there we go. We hear that dualistic thinking can get us into trouble, into troubling, painful situations. We think, okay, dualism is bad then. As Steve points out to us, he helps us to see that that's just more dualistic thinking. That now we've applied dualism to the concept of dualism. I don't know if that means we have, I don't know what that would be, quatrism, but we have dualism layered on dualism. And I think, again, we probably all encountered where we start to realize that we do something where it feels like we're in a vortex and we just keep turning back. Well, if I act out of a delusion, then they're about troubling situations. So I have to get rid of the delusion, but I can't get rid of it. And then we just start to go into this spiral that's based on dualistic thinking. What Steve points out to us then is that it's not something inherent about dualism, about it being good or bad, but it's the fact that we get stuck in dualism. That dualism is the way that the world makes sense to us. It's either this or it's that. How can it be both ways? And we can think of that very simply as, think of, you and your spouse or you and a friend. There's you and there's that other person, right? You can't, I don't know what I'm going to say there. You can't undo that. You know what I mean? That sense that there are two different people there seems to be very palpable. But what is it that we're sensing? And that's the thing that we don't question. So we get stuck in our ideas. We go, okay, that's the way reality is. And how is reality? Well, it's the way that you assume it to be. And I know I've brought this word up in previous talks, but there's something about that word assumption that seems really important to me, because assumption is the taking up of. So we have these beliefs, we have these intellectual understandings, conceptual understandings of how the world is, and we assume that to be true. We take that up in our very existence, or it seems to us that that's what we're doing. But again, we get stuck in dualism. We get stuck in our sense about how things are, and that includes how we understand these teachings. So we encounter these teachings. Steve's going to talk about this in a bit, as you can imagine, so we'll come back to this. But we encounter these teachings and we get an understanding of it. And from that understanding, we start to think, well, this is the way things are, because that's what the teachings say, and this is the way things are not. Or this is the way, sometimes I'll hear people say it this way, this is the way things should be, and this is the way they are. And I can assure you that should is not in our language. So if you're thinking that if the teachings are about the way things should be, just settle back and notice that you're doing that, that you're assuming something. You know, again, as we pointed out just from the previous passage, that if you try to put something into words, you're actually going to have problems with it. You're going to realize that reality doesn't match. And when you're talking about these teachings, then you get into this question that Steve gets into of the sacred and the profane, of the holy and the worldly. And there are two ways that we can, probably more ways, but I'm going to do this dualistically. There are two ways that we can turn these teachings into dualism very easily, into this idea of the difference between the sacred and the profane. One is to give more credence to the profane. And this one almost doesn't make sense to us because we think, well, I'm taking up Buddhism. You think that the holy or the sacred or that of the whole of reality, that would be the one you give credence to. But I want to start with this one because this is actually something that I hear a lot. The distinction that people will make is that these teachings are in some way lofty, or they're ideal. They're the ideal way that the world works. And then there's the real world. And that's the world that I live in. That's me having to go to work and me having to go shopping and that's the real world. So we make this distinction between the sacred and the profane is realer than the stuff that we encounter in the Zen teachings. I hear it and I've experienced it myself. So I know that this is something that we can do. And so we start talking about the real world. Yeah, but how do I apply this? Might be a way we might think of it. I'm not saying think of it this way. I'm just saying we might think of it this way. How do I apply this to the real world? How do I apply this to the things that are important to me? And if the real world is the mundane world, the profane world, well then what is the Buddhist world exactly? And there's a nice quote from Kosho Uchiyama. He talks a little bit about this, tendency we have to see a world that we've imagined and that we've constructed around our imaginings as the real world, and the Buddhist teachings as the not real world. So he's talking about Japanese culture. This is from his commentary in one of Kodo Sawaki's teachings in the book, The Zen Teaching of Homeless Kodo. Uchiyama says, during the student riots of the 60s and 70s, many people thought that discussing the consequences of the riots was talking about the reality of Japanese society. When the author Yukio Mishima killed himself by harakiri after a failed coup, a lot of people thought that talking about him was talking about reality. Actually, revolutions and wars often develop from overexcited, conditioned views and biased ways of thinking. That is, group stupidity. Such arguments have nothing to do with true reality. How hallucinatory are these ideas about reality? So he helps us to see that the way we usually talk about this, that there's this real world, and this is the world, like I said, it'd be the world of our workaday life, of interacting with people, but it's also this world, the larger world, the political, social things that are going on, that we go, that's going on right now. I have to do this Buddhist stuff right here, and this stuff is realer. And yet what we don't see is that stuff's actually like a dream world. And the reality is what the Buddhist teachings are pointing to. But again, we make this distinction. We don't even have to make the distinction I just made. It's all just reality showing up, but it's what it is that's showing up and how it is that we're interpreting it. So that's one way that we make dualism out of these teachings, is to give credence to more reality to the profane world. But another way we do it is we make a distinction between delusion and reality. As Steve calls it here, delusion and insight, or delusion and enlightenment. So we'll make that distinction. And in that one, delusion, which was just that world we were just saying had more reality to it than the Buddhist teachings. Now in that dualism, delusion becomes problematic. That's sort of like dualism was at the beginning of this. Dualism or delusion is to be deluded. Well, who the heck wants to be deluded? I'm no Rube me. You know, I understand how things are going. I see what I purchased my ticket. I can read what it says. You know, I know the truth. I know the reality. And so we make this distinction between delusion and insight, or delusion and enlightenment. And we may not think we've woken up. We may put it this way. Yeah, I'm not enlightened yet. This is not where I'm at. But someday, and we're going to talk about that in this essay as well. So we'll come back to that. But that's one way that dualism of delusion and enlightenment can show up, is to think, I'm not enlightened. I can't do this. I'm deluded. You know, ultimately, though, if we look at those terms, we can see that it doesn't make any sense. How can there be any distinction between enlightenment and delusion? They are reality working itself out right now. And in fact, we can see, even if we take them still in terms of their sort of dualistic relative nature, they come together. As all dualistic terms do, they always come together. Without delusion, enlightenment doesn't make sense. What is enlightenment then? Ultimately, what is enlightenment? Now, Steve goes on to say, this is why Bodhidharma, the Brahmin who brought Zen to China in the 5th century CE, said that holding dualistic views of ordinary and enlightened does not accord with the teaching of the awakened. According to Bodhidharma and to Zen, if we make enlightenment or enlightened people into something special and set them apart from others and from ourselves, we abuse them. In the process, we also abuse ourselves. Thus, enlightenment becomes remote, otherworldly, mysterious, and seemingly virtually impossible to realize. Zen is about freeing ourselves from such deluded thinking. So again, making that distinction between delusion and enlightenment, Bodhidharma points out to us that actually, what he calls, abuses the 3 treasures. So for those of you who come to our precept recitation, that's probably a teaching that's familiar to you. Not abusing the 3 treasures is the 10th grade precept that we recite. And Bodhidharma's teaching that Steve is alluding to here is in our chant book, and it is recited during the precept recitations. What Bodhidharma teaches is that self-nature is clear and obvious. By the way, the title of Steve's class, The Clear and Obvious Way. Self-nature is clear and obvious within the one Dharma. Not holding a dualistic view of ordinary and enlightened is called the precept of not abusing the 3 treasures. So not seeing ordinary and enlightened as 2 sides of something. It's either this way or this way. Not holding on to that. Understanding that the Dharma is one Dharma. That's what's clear and obvious. That's what we can know. That's what we do know, but ignore or explain away. Not holding that dualistic view is the precept of not abusing the 3 treasures. And the 3 treasures are Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. Buddha, which is truth, reality. Dharma, the teachings that point to truth, reality. Sangha, the community devoted to taking up this way. Now, I just gave definitions of those terms, and they're pretty surface level. Those are terms that you could actually probably have a class about, plumbing the depths of them. But I think for the nature of my talk, Buddha is truth or reality. Dharma, teachings that point to truth. Sangha is the community is devoted to take up this way. And so to make this distinction between delusion and enlightenment is to abuse these in that it is not how these work, to quote a way that, or to quote a wording that Steve uses a little bit later in this text. So we abuse it because then we might be thinking we're in a state of delusion and we need to work our way out of it. As Steve says, we might put ourselves, this is what I was talking about earlier, we might see enlightenment as something that's not here right now because I'm deluded. And so it's something that's apart from me. And so in something that's apart from me, it seems like it's something I can't even get, because to be honest, if you feel that it's apart from you, you're right, you're never going to get it because it's not apart from you. So you can sit there running around. It's like one of those days where you put a pencil behind your ear, push your sunglasses up, and then you walk around maybe aggravating your significant other going, where's that pencil? I just had it, and they're watching you walk around with it. And they don't say anything because to them, it's very funny that you still have that pencil there. But it's that same thing. If we make it outside of us and we go run around looking for it, we're never going to find it. But that's our tendency. But even making something out of enlightened and dualistic, even by saying, oh yeah, no difference between the two. You go, well, wait a minute, that's not dualistic thinking. Again, this can get subtle. If you're still hanging on to a difference and you say no difference, but you're hanging on to that difference, there's a difference. Yeah, I just read recently the beat writer Jack Kerouac, who wrote On the Road and The Dharma Bums and many other books. There was a woman who had just recently passed away who had been dating Jack Kerouac, I think at the time that On the Road came out. So she watched this significant change in his life as he went from being penniless nobody who had a bunch of unpublished manuscripts to being sort of like a best-selling author. That was the talk of the literary world for about 2 years. But she said that her impression of Kerouac's Buddhism was that he used it as an excuse to do whatever it is he wanted to do. So even though he maybe transcended delusion and enlightenment, he wasn't doing that. He was abusing the three treasures. He was seeing that there was deluded behavior, which was the behavior he was engaging in, and he was covering it up, with this explanation that no difference, illusion, delusion, enlightenment, the same. Well, when you're thinking in terms of that divide, it's not. You still engage in activities that are rooted very much in ego, in pride. Now, you might be listening to what I'm talking about if you heard Steve's passage. So here we're talking about the fact that, Bodhidharma helps us to see that there is no distinction to be made between delusion and enlightenment. Yet, at the end of this passage I read, it says, Zen is about freeing ourselves from such deluded thinking. And then everything that he just said seems to go out the window. It's like, well, why do we want to be free from deluded thinking if it's not right or wrong or good or bad? Or if there's not a distinction between delusion and enlightenment, why would we want to? So we get caught up in that. And as you might imagine, Steve addresses this in his next section of this text. He says, this isn't to say that distinctions cannot be made between ordinary and enlightened, but we have to realize that such distinctions take place only within our minds. No such distinctions actually occur in reality. There's never any particular person who is enlightened. Enlightenment doesn't work that way. By the same token, there's never any particular person who is deluded either. We only think there is. Indeed, the very notion of a particular person is dualistic, provisionally useful for getting through the day, certainly, but nevertheless not reflective of reality. So there it says, now this isn't to say that distinctions cannot be made between ordinary and enlightened. That we can make those distinctions. We might even understand, if nothing else intellectually, what that distinction might be, though I would press you to try to articulate that once and see if you can really say what that distinction is. And this is recently, again, I was just a word I was using in a study group and I just tossed it out and I knew what it meant and somebody asked me to define it and I couldn't. I was at a complete loss to talk about it. So we can make these distinctions between ordinary and enlightened. But remember, these distinctions are distinctions that take place only within our minds. Now, again, it can easily become dualism. In fact, it is dualism. I think about delusion and enlightened as being two different places, and one is this, and if you're there, you can't be there, and if you're there, you can't be there, then you've got dualism showing up, but we don't hang on to it. So if we realize we have dualism, this or that, then we know we're not dealing with the way reality shows up, that we have a conception going on, now we have an idea going on. So as long as we can make that distinction, just see that, just notice that it's an idea. Nobody's telling you to do anything about that. Our next thing is, oh, then I got to throw that away. No, you don't have to throw it away. Well, I got to liberate myself. Well, liberating yourself from it is just to notice that it's idea, to notice that it's conceptualization, to notice that it's dualism. That's it. That's all you got to do. You don't have to do anything more than that. If you can actually see that, and believe me, it's hard, because what I'm talking about is, what I tried to describe at the beginning of my talk is it feels instantaneous. Boom, here's this whole world and our understanding and our feelings about it and our assumptions that we make. Boom, here it is. Boom, here it is. So every moment is boom, here it is. And then we can see what's taking place. But we have to see what it is that's taking place. And what's taking place doesn't have this, this dualism, this division that perhaps at its most profound is the separation between subject and object, between me and you, between me and the world that's around me. Which is why Steve says there's never any particular person who is enlightened. Because to be enlightened is actually to see through our delusions. It's to see through the dualistic way that we see the world. It's to see through our conceptualizations. And the way we see through it is just to notice that we're doing that. And we understand, we know that the way we think the world works isn't the way the world works. We encounter that time and time again in our lives. So there's never any particular person who's enlightened, because that separates a person who's enlightened from the rest of the universe. It separates them from somebody who's not enlightened. In other words, it's dualistic, so it's conceptual. So we know that it's not the way reality is showing up. I remember it certainly seemed to be something that I heard when I first came to Dharma Field. People would ask Steve, so are you enlightened? And I remember I thought the same thing. I'd be sitting there, when I first came here, I was just like, oh, so he's an enlightened guy. He's got the scoop on this. He's seen the whatever it is that enlightenment means, and now he's sharing that with us. And so somebody would ask him, are you enlightened? And then, as you might imagine, with a twinkle in his eyes, Steve would say, no, I'm not. And then there'd be this either uproar or there'd just be this complete confusion. It's like, but why are you sitting there talking about this then? I don't understand what's going on here. But as Steve points out, the problem there again is just what it is we're assuming about experience that's showing up, how it is that we're taking what we're assuming to be true. And that's what makes us confused. That's what makes us go, huh? When you hear somebody like Steve say that. But he also reminds us there's no such thing as a deluded person either. That's just the way that we talk about things. There is just this reality, there's just this experience. As he points out, the very notion of a particular person is dualistic, because again, now you're getting back to, me and you. So as I pointed out before, you're not me, for example. But now we start to get into dualism, which I said was inherently limited. So what does that mean? Well, here's the interesting thing you probably don't know, or maybe you do know. But you know me, you know Steve Matuszak in ways that I don't, in ways that I can't. And I know me, I know Steve Matuszak in ways that you don't, and in ways that you can't. And there are lots of ways that neither of us know Steve Matuszak. So we can see again in that dualism, separation between me and other, that it's limited. It's always going to have that built into it because we're talking about conceptual understanding. And you're never going to be, I have a few friends who I think perhaps spent their youth, I assume they spent their youth this way, trying to know everything. And so they know a lot, but I can guarantee you there's a lot they don't know, and they'd probably tell you that. So now we move into a new section here. Steve says, as we become familiar with Buddhist teachings, we often get the idea that enlightenment is the ultimate prize. Then we naturally start to think, that's what I want. That's what I'm after. This is why I'm taking up this practice of meditation and studying these teachings so I can attain enlightenment. Such thinking is just more dualism, more delusion. Zen teachers, both ancient and modern, tell us repeatedly in many different ways that if this is our thinking, it's out of tune with reality. So there we have that, what I was calling quattrism, or we have that dualism of dualism. And this is how Bodhidharma is helping us to see that this mode of thinking, that this practice is going to take me to some place that's going to bring enlightenment to me. Enlightenment is to Zen Buddhism what touchdown is to American football. I'm going to get to the touchdown. I'm going to get to the end zone and and I get the points and I get the ultimate prize. And we can just see in that, just like that the end zone. Well, you could tell I'm a big football fan. Let's end something. When I get to the end zone, that's there yet. We still have to have somebody carrying the ball and then throwing it in a hoop. No, that's not. I'm not that bad. But they get into the end zone and they get that touchdown. But that's off there. And we think that's what I want, and that's why I'm doing this practice. And it might be how we start this practice out. I didn't really know, and I'm guessing this is actually true of a lot of people, what enlightenment even meant. When I would encounter these teachings, I'd be like, well, I guess I want that because it sounds like it's a cool place to be, the enlightenment zone, but I didn't really know what it was. But after a while, we can start to see that idea of I want enlightenment, that we can see that that's grasping after what? Well, if you're grasping after something, language already puts it in those terms, it's something, it's something. There's some kind of brass ring we can grab. And just know that if you have something, conceptualization is arising. And remember, at the beginning of this essay, Steve helps us to see conceptualization and dualism come hand in hand. So thinking of enlightenment as a prize that I want, that's why I'm doing this practice. That is more dualism. Steve continues, he says, typically we hear this, we take it in intellectually, and we even nod in agreement. That is, we hear that thinking of enlightenment is something that we get. We go, oh yeah, I get that. I'm not doing this practice for anything. I'm doing this practice. I've heard that Zazen is useless, so I'm not using this Zazen for anything. We hear that and we understand it. What we've done is we said, I got it. I got it. I got it. Well, just think about the way that we put that. I got it. I got it is there's something that you've got now. And as soon as you've got that, as soon as that's showing up, just know you've got something, which means there's conceptualization going on, which means that dualism is arising with it. Just know that. That's what you want to observe. So if you got it, you ain't got it. It's a Mel Brooks joke, I think, where this guy's pulling these big trunks. He's like a porter. He's not a very good porter. So he's pulling these trunks. He goes, I got it. I got it. I got it. And he drops the trunks. I ain't got it. And that's, if you got it, you ain't got it. You're going to drop those trunks at some point. They're going to get too heavy for you because they don't match reality. And you're going to come bumping up against that. So again, usually we'll hear this teaching that thinking that you want to be enlightened is just more dualism, more delusion. But in our hearts, we still hang on to it. Or just like I was talking about somebody who might say, Jack Kerouac, who might say, yeah, there's no difference between delusion and enlightenment. In the meantime, you know that he understands that he's acting out of delusion and he's just trying to cover it up. So if we think we got it, we ain't got it. Just notice that you're doing that. And as Steve points out, he says, typically we hear this, we take it in intellectually and we're not in agreement, but we don't take it to heart. We think about dualism and project it out there as though it were somebody else's problem. We say, oh yes, dualism, it's not good. Thus, we apply an extra layer of dualism to the subject of dualism itself, and all the while we don't look at where we stand. We need to digest this teaching and take it to heart. We need to realize in each moment what this teaching is pointing to and what we're doing with it instead. So again, what Steve says is the way we normally might encounter this teaching to get it is then to put dualism out there as something that we can either engage with or not engage with, that we can either have or not have. And you can hear just in the way I'm putting it, now granted, I'm putting it that way, but I think it's the way we would think of it, that there's dualism built right into that. So as Steve points out, that's just another layer of dualism that we're applying to dualism. So we miss out what the teaching is pointing to. And what is the teaching pointing to? He tells us, he says, we don't look at where we stand. We don't look at where we stand. Where are you standing right now? What's showing up right now? We think dualism's out there, something to deal with out there. Either it's here or it's not here. I don't have to worry about it. No dualism showing up in my house. It's out there. Or, oh, I got a bunch of dualism here. What do I do with it? How do I get rid of this stuff, right? And there we are. So we just see that's how we're seeing the world. He says we need to digest this teaching and take it to heart. That means to just stop blabbing about it. It's just to sit with it, to sit with what it is that's showing up. Steve continues, he says, we can't actually say what truth or reality is. So again, if you think you can pin this down and say, I know reality is unpin downable, to quote Norm, I know it's that way, right? Just look at that. Look at what it is you're doing. Norm's not telling you to think that way. That's not what that teaching is pointing out to. But again, it's our usual way when we encounter something like that, especially when it's a teaching like that's as fun as unpin downable. It seems to really get to us. There we go. I want that one, right? That's reality. I can tell you what reality is. But about all we can say about reality is that we can't say anything about reality. That's about the best we can do with it. So we can't actually say what truth or reality is. Whatever we do say is dualistic by virtue of the fact that it's been verbalized, put into conceptualized form. Zen teaching goes beyond any merely intellectual understanding. We need to come back to this repeatedly and soak in it so we can truly digest it and practice it. We can learn to come back to this moment. We can start to recognize our dualistic thinking as it takes place within our mind. We can learn to see our grasping and judging. We can see how we reach for what we deem sacred and how we spurn for what we imagine to be profane. When we see how we do this, we can also learn to see how not to get caught up in it. So Steve points out that we need to go beyond merely intellectual understanding. Now, there's nothing wrong with, so we'll hear that, we'll go, okay, intellectual understanding, bad. Again, look again, dualism showing up there. Right or wrong, good or bad, once you're starting to do that, dualism is showing up. Intellectual understanding is not bad. And in fact, when you're encountering language like we're doing here in concepts, intellectual understanding is going to show up. Just see it for what it is. Remember, the trouble we have is we don't see it for what it is. Instead, we think our intellectual understanding is the truth, and it's not. Truth is just what's showing up right here. Our intellectual understanding hopefully points us to that. It helps us to see the truth. As Steve says, I really like that phrase where he says, what we do is we come back to this repeatedly and soak in it so we can digest it and practice it. That Zen teaching goes beyond mere intellectual understanding. We can't intellectualize this. We'll go, okay, I get that. Got it, right? And what about got it? Got it, ain't got it. And so if you got it, you ain't got it. This goes beyond mere intellectual understanding. What we can see are our impulses to understand what's going on, to explain what it is that's going on. Notice that. I bet that your desire to fill that vacuum with an answer is pretty strong. Maybe it's not, but look at any situation you're in where it looks like an answer is being called for. And do you give the answer? Yes, you do. Ding, 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 ding. I mean, I do that. I still, it was a real problem for me for a long time. I was a teacher, right? I was supposed to be the answer man. And I remember giving a talk about the formal construction of comics. So I was really just trying to say, all right, here's what comics are and here's what comics aren't. Now do we recognize what I was doing there? It's an intellectual understanding. So I was coming up with dualistic structures, and then I tried to articulate what I was trying to say. And as I tried to articulate it, it just wasn't working. It wasn't coming out right. And the audience just zoomed in on that. And that was what we spent a lot of time. And I remember that I had a full-blown panic attack as they were asking me these questions that I had no answer to. And I felt like it was my job to put an answer in there. And I know that's just me, but I do think it's human nature to want to explain something and to want to put an answer there. There's a question, and that question might be something we pose for ourselves, and then we explain it, we answer it. So we can just notice when that's the impulse we have. We can see that and just see that that's going to be conceptual. It's not that it's wrong, but is a conceptual answer needed at this moment? Do we need to go there? Is this where we need to head? Is this what we're looking for at this particular moment? I would even say take it a step further. And if it is the intellectual idea you're going to offer helpful? Or is it just there to cause problems? So is it coming from the whole? Is whatever it is you're going to offer wholesome? Or is it intended to fragment, to break things up, to create division? Steve continues, he says, our thinking and conceptualizing, far from giving us a handle on truth, obstruct our natural ability to see reality directly. Our thinking, no matter how or what we think, is out of step with how things actually are. Once you see this for yourself, you will stop endlessly frustrating yourself by trying to figure out what's going on. It will be obvious that whatever conceptual answer you come up with will be dualistic, while reality is not. It will also be obvious that what is needed is not an explanation or an answer, but only direct seeing. So yeah, I was just kind of addressing that in my last comments. The only thing I guess I would point out is that Steve says that our thinking and conceptualizing, far from giving us a handle on truth, obstruct our natural ability to see reality directly, because it's just right here. And that's the thing, you say that and people are like, where is it? Well, there you go. That's exactly, or what do you mean? What do you mean by it's right here? Exactly. Now see that. See what it is you're doing. See what that impulse is. See what it is that you want to do. Remember, Steve told us that this teaching was about, where do you stand? It's what are you doing right now? What are you doing with these teachings? And just notice that. You don't even have to stop doing what you're doing. And we'll think that, oh yeah, well, I'll just stop that. The way you stop it is actually just noticing it. Just notice you're doing it. Odds are, if you notice, you really got this impulse to boom, and you understand that boom is just gonna, muddy the waters up more. You just don't do it. You don't have to stop yourself. You just see that's what's taking place. And with clarity. If not, you just, boom, out it comes. And I remember somebody telling me that he was in a situation where he was very unhappy with something that had happened at a restaurant. And he wanted to say something very sharp-tongued to the waiter. And he knew that he wanted to say something sharp-tongued to the waiter. And he knew that wasn't going to be helpful to anybody. And still, when the waiter came, out of his mouth it came. And we just see we're doing that. Just notice you're doing that. You don't have to go, ah, what an idiot. I just told myself not to say that. Just out it comes. You don't excuse it. You don't kick yourself for it. Now it's said. Now the milk has been spilled, so to speak. The bell has been rung. As Tom Waits wrote, American singer-songwriter, you can't unring a bell. Actually, I really like the way he put it. He said, you can't unring a bell, Junior. Just to make sure you see there's not a lot of depth going on in that. Can't unring a bell. So Steve says, truth isn't an idea or a belief. It isn't graspable. It isn't even conceivable. Still, it can be directly seen. Little by little, we can acquire a taste of just what's true and real, understanding that it's neither sacred nor profane. We can learn to see it directly without requiring an explanation for it. The fact is, truth is something we already know. We only need to come back to it and settle down. We only need to be reminded of it. So truth it's just right here. It's what we're experiencing all the time, except we get ideas, we create dualistic structures, we buy into those dualistic structures, and that's what we tend to interact in the world with. We tend to see then that as diluted behavior and not enlightened behavior, perhaps. So we get back to, as Steve points out, when we really see what's taking place, no sacred nor profane, right? That does not show up. Ultimately, that doesn't make any sense. Reality is the stuff of our daily lives, but how is it showing up? How is reality appearing? Is it conceptualized? Is it dualistic? Okay, that's what's showing up. That's how reality is showing up. Reality is the sacred. Reality is totality. Everything that's showing up is all beings showing up as what's showing up. No sacred, no profane, no mundane, no holy. You could say everything is holy. And if you think about that, and that was an idea that really I took to, I might have encountered it in Bill Moyer's interviews with Joseph Campbell. I can't remember, but it seems right that that's where I first encountered that. And it seemed like such a lovely idea that everything was holy, everything was sacred. But if you think about it, if everything's sacred, well, then nothing is. It just becomes pointless to even call it sacred. If everything is sacred, bumblebee is sacred, dust is sacred. That sounds like a Allen Ginsberg poem I'm reciting here, earwax is sacred, flower is sacred, thought is sacred. If all that's sacred, then what's the point of even put is sacred on there? What's being done there? So again, we can see that in doing that, in thinking that everything is sacred, we're making a distinction still, even if it seems like we're not. So we can just let that go. In reality, neither sacred nor profane. And yeah, I knew when I decided to talk about a chapter in the book, I was like, that's probably going to take the full hour. And I pretty much did. So I apologize for that. And I know it's Father's Day, so of course I picked this day to go on and on. But if people have a question that maybe we can address quickly, or a comment they want to make, I'm certainly open to that. All right, I've had you sitting here long enough. Thank you so much for showing up. And again, happy Father's Day, everyone.